In this week's video I'm trying a new idea. I'm sewing on paper and dabbling with paint and playing with papers like these. I'm making this rose in a paper vase, making it really easy for you to do too. I'll be sewing around the base here using my little sewing machine and using acrylic paints to paint the flower, although any pencils or paints will do. You could make a rose in a vase to add to your own junk journals like the ones I've been making this week. You could tuck it into a little pocket, like the one on the left there. You could add it to a journal spread with other papers and colours. Or you could add it on a page as a tuck spot or a belly band and stuff some lovely little ephemera in behind it. And for the first step, you can indulge your paper passion and choose a pattern for the vase. And if you have this passion for paper like me, you love journaling, you love paper and making ephemera and supplies, then hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because I do have lots more videos to come. I've pulled a few papers out of my stash here in colours that I thought would work with that rose, in the same tones of pink and green and smaller patterns. And this is an example of an itsy ditsy pattern that I think works very well. So the size of that little pattern there doesn't overcrowd the rose, it's dainty. And equally, a lovely lime green is fresh and uplifting and I think works with flora and fauna really well. We also need to choose a backing paper, and I'm taking a page from this lovely vintage book with yellowing papers. It's a 1930s English dictionary. You could of course put the flower on the front of your journal cover. It was just another idea I thought I'd share. So I'm taking a page because I think the white and that vintage aged paper works really well together. Tearing it out really carefully because the paper in this book is quite delicate. It makes it fun to sew when we come to that with the machine a little bit later. If you don't have any vintage books, then there are lots of other types of book pages that you can use. So this is a beautiful large geography book with some pretty little font. The paper is quite matte and relatively thick, and I think that would work really well even with the images behind. Do you also love using maps and atlases in your junk journals? I do. I found this one this week. It's an incredibly huge book, as you can see. It hardly even fits on the screen. It's got hundreds of pages of beautiful maps, and I think this would work quite well as a backing paper. So the green in the maps I think is a useful play to reflect the leaves to make that look really fresh. The paper is quite thick and I'm just addicted to maps and atlases, so I like it, and that's what I think I might use for some of the background papers to my rose. I have lots of books with glossy pages like this, so I'm really enjoying projects which make use of these. And I made some stuffed pockets last week. I shared this in a video. I'll put a link in the description box down below. I think it would work well as a backing paper to the rose because I discovered by making these stuffed pockets that the pages are quite robust. So although I'm not quite so sure about the patterns and colours, in terms of thickness and robustness, you can still use them. Today I'm venturing forth into the world of acrylic paint, and it's pretty new to me. I'm using this lovely large box of Arteza acrylic paints. I did show them to you a couple of weeks ago when I did my junk journal ideas for 2020. I used the white tube for snow on a little teardrop scene there, but I haven't really cracked open the colours, so today I want to pick just 2 or 3 simple colours to see if we can have lots of fun and create something to use in our junk journals in the form of that rose. If you've got pencils or maybe watercolour paints, then definitely have a go with those too. If you can, then tag me on Instagram or Facebook because I'd love to see what you do. The colours that I'm choosing to use today are olive green, it's a very vintage natural green, rose and yellow green, which is quite uplifting and fresh. I'm also using some pens to draw the stalk of the rose and the leaves. It just makes things a little bit easy. So I've pulled out some green pens. These are Arteza real brush pens, and they're in similar colours to the paints, and also a darker Inconic pen which I'll use just towards the end to bring that rose a little bit more to life. We need some scissors today and some brushes, so I have a couple of sized water brushes and a thicker brush, and that white one I actually bought in a set of 10, just a cheap set of 10 from eBay. And it's time to take our backing paper and cut it into a tall rectangular piece. You can see I've been getting rather carried away with making a few of these. Once you start, I think you'll be addicted. Do let me know if you make them, by the way. Drop me a comment down below. In terms of the size of the papers here, just make the most of the book page that you've got. You want a piece that's relatively tall and not very wide, something for the rose to rest on. So I'm cutting this piece of vintage paper in two, and that will do me a couple of those roses. And I'm also obviously thinking about the dimensions of the pages in my journal, if I want to put it on the front cover or maybe on an internal page as a journal spread. I take a piece of pattern paper that's about half the height of the book page, and I think it's perfectly fine to have a ripped edge. In fact, I prefer a ripped edge at the top of the vase rather than a straight line. And the size of this piece is just a little less than the book page itself, so you can see a border there. I'm using my new little sewing machine to put a border on that vase. You could glue the paper to the book page and make a vase in that way too, so you don't have to have a sewing machine, but I am really enjoying using this and learning how to use some of those stitches. This model is very light, it has about 10 different stitches, it's just under 2 kilograms, which makes it very easy to move around the desk and put in position when we want to have a play. I'm sewing around 3 sides of the pattern paper here to create the vase, and I'm going to use a couple of different stitch types that, having had a good play this week, seem to work really well together. So bringing the foot down and pressing on the pedal, off we go. And I'm starting with a zigzag stitch, and then about 2/3 of the way down one side I just switch to a straight running stitch. Turning the corner, I'm getting a little bit better at this. Sometimes I remember to keep the needle in and that makes life easier, sometimes I don't. And as I said, as a beginner, I am super open to your ideas and comments for how to make life easy and learn new tips and techniques for using the sewing machine. And a huge thank you to those of you who did leave comments on my last video, because I read every single one and I'm learning as I go. So really appreciate the feedback you give me as I work through this process and go on this journey. And just to prove it's not a fluke, here I'm sewing a second vase. So again, working down one side of the vase to begin with a zigzag. It's not a huge zigzag, it's I think one of the medium sized stitches, and then switching over to a medium sized running stitch. I've found that if the running stitches are too small, it's not as easy on the paper, particularly when it's vintage paper and it's delicate. I would like to say a big thank you to Rachel from Roxy Creations and also Tracy Fox here on YouTube for giving me some of the inspiration and a little bit of confidence to have a go at this sewing game on paper. I wonder how many of you also watch their channels. Drop me a comment down below. And here we have a vase, a sewn vase that's ready for the rose or indeed any other flower that you feel like drawing, painting or colouring. Drawing and painting the rose is just as easy as the vase itself, and I'll take you through it step by step. You can see from the mess I've already made on the palette that I've been having a bit of a play, having a go, and I think that's what 2020 is all about for me. I'm granting myself more of a right to play, more of a right to fail, more of a right to just do it my own way, and I hope that you're having fun and maybe doing something like that too. Let me know. One of the reasons I chose acrylics to paint the rose today is it seems to leave a thicker and glossier result, and I quite like the effect it has at the top of the rose here. So I get a variation in colour, a little bit of gloss, and maybe even just a little bit of lift from the paint on the page. But as any project on this channel has to be super easy, I'm going to begin by just drawing a wiggly stalk, adding some natural wiggles, 3 or 4 there, just to represent the beauty of nature, because nothing's really in straight lines in nature. I'm drawing the rosebud at the top as well using that pen, and then I'm going to thicken the stalk using one of my real brush pens. And I like to do this rather than draw 2 lines for the stalk and colour it in. It seems to give a more natural edge to the stalk, and as well it's just really easy. And I'm taking another colour, a similar colour, just running over the same stalk, just adding a little bit of depth and a little bit of interest, a bit of variation again. And now we can have some fun painting the petals with that beautiful shade of rose. I need a little pot of clean water, getting that ready to hand, and I'm just choosing one of my brushes, and I think I'll use the thicker soft brush to swoosh and get some natural movement in those petals. The other 2 brushes, as you can see, I've got a smaller one and a medium one, and I'll be using those on the leaves. But let's begin by getting just a bit of water, not too much, into that paint. We want it to be relatively thick so that it leaves some gaps on the paper, leaving a little bit of white to come through. And all I'm doing is just pressing the brush onto the paper, moving mostly in movements towards the tip of the rose. And a tip when painting this rosebud is really less is more, and by that I mean feel free to put the paintbrush down when there's still paper showing through those petals. I'm going to add the leaves now, so again making life very easy. I thought it might be good to just mark where I want them to go, so probably with an odd number because that seems to look better. I'm just making some little marks with an Inconic green pen, again in a similar colour to the paint shades I've used. And then I'm just picking up some of the paint that we'd already put on the palette, and I'm creating a bit of a ridge at the top, at the tip of that brush, so that I can easily add to the paper a bit of a stalk before I press down and fill in the leaf. So keep that brush tip quite narrow, and I'm also using the smaller brush, again they're both water brushes, just to fill in the leaves, probably making those that are towards the base of the stem a little bit bigger. Just taking my time, press down on the paper and pull off. If you enjoy using paint in your Junk and Art journal spreads, then check out my playlist. I'll leave a link in the description box down below. I've got lots of journal spreads that I've done over the last year or so using different types of paint, and you might enjoy just watching 1 or 2 of those. I'm finishing off the bud of the rose with some more green, with some foliage underneath the petals, and I think this really helps it to be a little bit more 3D to look at. So I'm creating some arcs of green, just flicking both on the front of those petals, and then also just representing some little pieces that will sit behind, so it feels like the greenery is pushing out from behind the bud. I work down the stalk and add a little bit more colour as well. Really just sit back and look at what you've created and think, where would I expect to see some of that foliage sticking out? What would I see? There's the pieces sticking behind the petal. I'm using the narrow brush for this, flicking around at the top, a little bit underneath, because from where we're sitting our eye would see that, and then finally adding just a bit more texture and darker colour on those petals, again making it feel more rounded. This fine tipped pen, it's an Inconic pen in a shade of medium brown, is great for adding just a little bit of texture to the leaves and the stalk, and I think that works well for a rose that does tend to have some spiky scratchy bits. I don't want it to feel too smooth, so again I'm just adding a few little extra pieces of texture to the petals at the top. And now we have a rose that can fit in our vase, and I just wanted to take a moment to show you a few of the projects that I've been playing with this week using scraps of paper, a bit like the scraps that we can use for the rose vase. So these are just a few of the types of ephemera that you might want to make to tuck in behind the rose if you use it as perhaps a tuck spot or a belly band. So really easy collaging with pieces of paper. Let me know if you're interested in seeing those, and I can do a video on that for you. I'll show you in a minute how I'm planning to use it in a February journal spread, but first I need to trim it down, taking a piece off the bottom there. we need to do just a little bit of easy fussy cutting to be able to slip it neatly into the space of the vase, into the opening where we've done the sewing. So all I'm doing is just taking my time cutting around it, leaving roughly the same amount of white paper around all the borders, maybe not going too close to the stem because that's a little bit difficult, but bringing this to be more of a rose than a picture of a rose on a piece of paper. And inevitably it's going to be just a little bit too wide. I need to cut a little bit more off, but just trim a little bit so that it fits, and you've got a piece of beautiful ephemera, perhaps for a February journal spread, perhaps for the cover of a journal. How rewarding, how satisfying to sew, to play with paper, and to put this maybe in a traveller's notebook. So I'm planning to put this into my February journal spread in my next video. I've done some sewing, which was one of my commitments to myself. Moving on from my January spread there, this will be on the left hand side, and I'm going to put some notes and do some journaling on the right. Join me next week.